So welcome to this week's Optimal Health Clinic Facebook Live. And this week I wanted to talk about the importance of getting to a place where you are able to push forwards. And I don't mean push forwards in terms of pushing beyond where you are, but I mean taking steps where you can start to increase your capacity. So to put this in the context of bouncing the boundaries, when we talk about creating a baseline, we're talking about having a stable baseline from which you can then start to take step forwards. You can start to bounce the boundaries, you can start to increase your capacity. And as I've been talking about this recently, one of the ways that I've been thinking about it is it's a little bit like in sport, in something like, football or American football or rugby, whatever it may be, where there's playing on the offense, where you're being offensive, where you're pushing forwards, where you're trying to score, or you're on the defense, where you're being attacked and you're defending and you're having to try and protect from the opposition team scoring. And this is what it can feel like when we're working on bouncing the boundaries, because if what we're finding is we're constantly having crashes, we're constantly trying to rebound, we're constantly finding that we're kind of struggling, we're not sure where we are, we're not moving forwards, we're on the defense. We're on the defense, it's obviously physically difficult, but it's also emotionally frustrating because we don't feel like we're making progress. And it's much more draining being on the defense than it is being on the offense, in terms of pushing forwards. When we have a stable baseline, when we're at a point where we are kind of solid in terms of our capacity, we've got our pacing working, so we know what our limits are, how much we can do, how much we can't do, we know when to rein it in, when to rest. When we have that stable baseline, then we can start to challenge. Then we can start to move forwards. Then we can start to bounce the boundaries. And that's where we can start to feel like we're on the offense, where we're starting to push forwards. And psychologically and emotionally, it's a much more empowering place to be. It's much more, we feel much more hopeful when we feel like we're taking steps forwards, when we feel like we're challenging the norm. Of course, if we do too much offensive and we do it recklessly, we end up immediately on the defense, right? If we try and push forward too much, what we find, and we don't cover our kind of bases, then we're suddenly back on the defense again. So we have to kind of lock down the key pieces. We have to have our defense in place. We have to find our baseline. We have to be stable at the baseline. And then we can start to push forwards. Then we can start to bounce the boundaries. We can start to try new things. That can be increasing activity level. That can be, trying different foods, different environments. This is obviously something which is, and I probably should have said this at the start, I'm specifically talking about later stage 2 and stage 3 on the recovery path. I guess at each stage there's an offense and a defense. But in this context, I guess I'm specifically talking about late stage 2 and into stage 3. And that's often where we start to feel, especially if we've been rising up from stage 1 to stage 2 and to stage 3. That's where we feel like we have some wind in ourselves. We feel like we have some momentum. If you feel like you're constantly on the defense, you want to look at that. I think I did a video 3 or 4 weeks ago where I did the 3 or 4 keys, things that I look at when I'm working with a patient to identify what to work on and how to move forwards. That video is effectively when someone's stuck on the defense, that's the steps that I would go through in checking them. So that's just kind of tying up to that. And looking at things like if we've taken on too much, if we are missing pieces of the jigsaw, then we're going to feel like we're constantly on the defensive and we're constantly kind of crashing and booming and busting. But we want to the first thing is we're on the defense, we want to get stable. And when we're on stable, we want to get on the offense in terms of pushing forwards. And I think one of the other pieces around this that I wanted to speak to is we can find that if we've had a habit in the past of trying to do too much too quickly, trying to push ourselves, and ending up spending a lot of time on the defense, then we can become fearful about going on the offensive in terms of pushing forwards. It's almost like we're terrified of taking risks, so we want to stay in our comfort zone and stay safe. And ultimately, you do not push yourself to recovery. You also don't necessarily rest yourself to recovery. That's a part of it. You get in a healing state and you heal yourself to recovery. So you don't move forwards by pushing, but when it's time to push edges, when it's time to bounce the boundaries, when it's time to go on the offense, we need to do that. And we need to do that in such a way we protect the downside. We have our defensive play in place. So we kind of, when we, if you think about it in a let's say a football analogy, we want to make sure that we've got defense lined up. We've got our kind of midfielders kind of feeding shots into the strikers, and then the strikers are kind of are on the attack. And then if we're getting more aggressive, we start to move more of the team forwards, and we start to have more of a focus towards attacking. But we do that knowing we've got the defense in place. If we try to attack without having the defense in place, we end up, using a football analogy, if you try to push too many people forwards, you don't get the defense in place. If you slip up, you're almost guaranteed to concede a goal because you haven't got the defense in place. So you need to have the defense locked down, but ultimately, as we progress and move forwards, we need to take calculated risks. And that's exactly what happens in the sports metaphor, that you have push enough people forward, but you calculate the risk to make sure that you've got enough people that are in defense as well. So really the question is, are you on the offensive or the defensive? If you're spending too much time on the defensive, how do you get to a baseline? If you're spending too much time at the baseline and not moving forwards, do you need to go on the offensive? And if you're going on the offensive and immediately on the defensive, then what are you missing in terms of having the stability and the pieces in place behind it? So tonight's video is a simple principle. It's a kind of mapping piece to map where you are in the process. But then we recognize that can help inform the next piece of strategy. So Rachel's saying this is where I'm struggling finding a baseline, as when I have a not too bad day, I push too hard, then crash. So that's a good example of something that a lot of people do, where they get to the point, they get the baseline, and then they get over enthusiastic. And that's a good example of not having enough defense in place, of thinking, right, I can do it, right, I'm just going to push on and do it. And the temptation is obviously there, and the frustration builds up through not being able to do things. But it is really important in days like that to rein it in, because it's better to have a day which is less than you ideally would have done, but build it as a foundation to be able to then build on that the next day, rather than having a great day and the whole thing crashing back down again. Jane is saying, I've never been able to find my baseline. I think we've done some pieces around the boundaries before. I'm open to doing a video in the future on establishing a baseline. It is challenging and it is different for everyone, and some of that needs some practitioner input to recognize what's getting in the way of that and what the patterns are that are tripping that up. Suzanne is saying, I find it difficult to hold back when there are so many things to do, and that is the challenge. And I think it's a classic challenge people have. We've been restricted for a long time and we start to get some energy. We either want to do all the things we haven't been able to do that we love to do, or all the things we don't really want to do but haven't been done that need to be paid attention to. And that definitely is a challenge, and it requires discipline. It also requires awareness to see the pattern. If you can see it, you don't have to be it. Alison saying, at the summer I found a good baseline, but I have found since then it's been slipping backwards. Is it normal to find winter harder? Yes, it can be for some people. It can be different reasons. It can be physical reasons, can be psycho-emotional reasons. But as always, you need to be a detective and figure out what's going on. Sandra's saying, just going to make a drink in the kitchen, and chronic pain is that pacing is awful. I try two things, it's heartbreak, I can't do anymore. Yeah, it's obviously immensely frustrating to not be able to do the things. That's why getting the right support and the right strategies in place is obviously so important. So I hope that's been useful. I'm on my mission to try and keep these videos as bite-sized as I can at 10 minutes. So let's finish there. Thank you for watching. And I'm doing the next week's video. And then I believe Maria is going to be doing the 2 weeks after that. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.